The barge lurched hard to the left, and Charles Prescott threw his weight against the steering pole before the current could drag them sideways into the shallows. He was already soaked through to the collar, already squinting through mist so thick it swallowed the far bank whole, already calculating the depth of the next bend by the sound the water made against the hull. And then the woman on the bow moved, and every calculation he'd been running for the past 20 years of ferryman work vanished from his head like smoke. She was standing at the prow with her arms crossed over her chest, and her chin lifted at the fog, the way most people lifted their chins at enemies. She was taller than Charles by half a head, maybe more, and the body beneath her fitted warrior's leathers was built on a scale that was entirely intentional, all long muscle and deliberate power, a frame that had been tested until it proved itself worthy. The leathers themselves were dark, oiled, form-fitting across the torso, and laced tight up the sides with cord gone the color of old copper, with close-fitted bracers buckled over her forearms and a single wide belt cinched at her waist. Her green skin caught the pale moorlight and turned it into something warmer, almost amber in places, and her dark hair was pulled back in two thick ropes that hung between her shoulders. The two lower tusks that curved gently upward from her jaw were notched along the outer edges old nicks, old battles in her eyes were the deep, steady gold of a lantern burning against a real wind. She was an orc woman. In this part of the world, along the Thornmere border, that meant most ferrymen would have charged her double, or told her the barge was full, or simply looked the other way until she found another crossing. Charles had done none of those things. He had offered her a hand aboard, which she had not taken, not out of hostility, just out of pride, and he had told her the fare and held out his hand for payment. And when she had paid it exact and without argument, he had gone back to his work. That was 20 minutes ago. He hadn't said another word. Neither had she. The fog pressed in around them, dense and ancient feeling, the kind that settled on the moorlands between the standing stones and didn't move until mid-morning. Charles had grown up on the Thornmere, raised on the flat-bottomed barge his father had built and worked his whole short life. He knew every shelf of stone beneath the crossing, every current that tried to pull you south toward the fast water. He knew the moor. He knew the river. He did not know anything about the woman standing at his prow, except that she was carrying a war-cloak over one arm, a heavy, sweeping thing, dyed the deep red of old embers, trimmed at the edges with something dark, and that she watched the far bank come out of the fog the way a general watched a fortification she was already planning to take. "There's a stone shelf 4 feet under the surface ahead," Charles said, mostly because a pilot who didn't warn his passengers deserved whatever lawsuit the gods handed him. "Step back from the bow. The barge is going to angle." She stepped back, not because he'd asked, he suspected, but because she'd already read the water and agreed with him. The barge scraped stone, tilted 2 degrees, and Charles walked his body along the rail to compensate, leaning until his knuckles whitened on the pole. They cleared the shelf with a low groan of wood and settled again. "You do this alone," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Most crossings, yes. In fog like this. Especially in fog like this. Fewer people trying to talk to me while I work." There was a beat of silence. Then, very quietly, she made a sound in her chest that might have been a laugh. It was brief, controlled, swallowed almost before it reached him, but it had been there. He stole a glance at her. She was looking at him now, not the bank, and the assessment in those gold eyes was thorough. Not unkind, just very, very honest. "Urzoth Fireblood," she said. "Charles Prescott." He adjusted the pole. "First time crossing to the Thornmere side." "No," she paused. "First time crossing with a ferryman who doesn't ask what my business is." He shrugged. "Your business is your business. I'm only responsible for getting you to the other side in one piece." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Fireblood is a clan name, not a threat. I didn't think it was one." He frowned at the current. "Though it does sound like one if I'm honest." Another beat. Another controlled, almost swallowed sound. This one was definitely a laugh. The far bank came fully out of the fog then, dark earth and pale sedge, and the beginning of the moorland road that ran north toward Kettenvale and south toward the border stones. A rutted track, honest and unpretentious, cutting through heather and old mud. There was a wagon waiting at the landing, 2 men in wool coats, watching the barge approach with the particular expression of people who had not expected to see what they were seeing. Charles read them easily. One was Brant Culver, who ran the Kettenvale Grazing Cooperative and had been watching the north boundary of the moorlands get eaten up by contested surveys for the better part of a year. The other was a man Charles didn't recognize, broader across the shoulders, standing a half step behind Culver with his thumbs in his belt and something in his posture that felt like a drawn-back bowstring. Urzoth had read them too. He saw her shoulders settle, not sag, settle, like a soldier taking a breath before the charge. The barge touched the landing dock with a soft thud, and Charles ran out the boarding plank. He stepped aside to let her off first, because that was how you ran a proper crossing, and because some quiet, ungovernable instinct in him wanted to be between whatever those 2 men were about to say and the woman who had paid her fare and earned her passage. "What is this?" Culver's voice was loud in the fog-dampened quiet. "You're bringing orcs across my river now, Prescott." "It's not your river, Brant." Charles tied off the line. "And she's a paying customer. She's one of the Fireblood clan. They've been camped at the north boundary stones for 2 weeks. Our boundary stones." "I don't know anything about boundary stones." Charles looked up from the cleat. "I know she paid her fare and I brought her across. That's the whole of it." Culver looked at Urzoth with a hard, measuring displeasure. Urzoth looked back at him with the calm, absolute absence of fear that Charles found profoundly impressive. She did not flinch. She did not set her jaw or narrow her eyes or do any of the things a person did when they were bracing for impact. She simply looked at him, as if she were cataloging him for future reference and finding the entry fairly short. "Tell her to turn around," Culver said. "Tell her the Thornmere side isn't open to her kind." "I can tell her that," Charles said agreeably, "and she'll probably tell me where I can put the information." "She's an adult with her own legs, Brant. I'm a ferryman, not a gatekeeper." The man behind Culver, the broad one, had put a hand on the short axe at his belt. It wasn't quite drawing it. It was the step before drawing it. Charles felt something cold and clear move through him, not fear exactly, more like the sensation of stepping onto ice you weren't sure would hold. Urzoth spoke before he could. Her voice was low and utterly steady. "Move the hand off the axe," she said to the broad man. "I have business on this side of the river. Border business with the Kettenvale Land Commission, not with you." "Land Commission doesn't deal with orcs," Culver said. "The commission deals with anyone holding a boundary claim." She reached into the satchel at her hip and produced a folded paper sealed with green wax. "Which I do. Filed 7 days ago at the Thornmere courthouse. Check their records if you doubt me." Culver stared at the seal. Something shifted in his expression, not retreat exactly, but a recalibration. He'd expected ignorance or anger. He'd gotten neither. "This isn't finished," he said. "I didn't imagine it was," Urzoth said. Culver turned and walked back toward the wagon. The broad man held his ground for 2 seconds longer, looking at Charles with a particular kind of contempt, and then followed. The wagon rattled away into the moor road fog and disappeared. The landing went quiet, just the river and the wind moving through the sedge. Charles looked at Urzoth. She was tucking the paper back into her satchel with the focused calm of someone completing a task they'd expected to be unpleasant. "Land claim," he said. "Yes." "The grazing lands at the north boundary." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the things he knew about those boundary lands and what Culver had been doing with them for the past 3 seasons. "That's going to get worse before it gets better," he said finally. "I know." She looked at him, those gold eyes direct and unashamed. "Does that change your position on ferrying me across?" He thought about it for exactly the amount of time it deserved. "No," he said, "fair is fair." Something shifted in her expression, very small, very brief, but it had shifted and she had let him see it. She set off north along the moor road, and Charles went back to the barge. And for the rest of the morning he ran empty crossings through the fog and thought about gold eyes and old boundary stones, and the sound a woman made when she was deciding whether or not to trust you. She came back to the landing 3 days later, at dusk, with mud on her boots and a split along her left cheekbone that was beginning to purple at the edges. Charles was tying off the last crossing of the day when he saw her come over the sedge ridge. He set down the rope and straightened. She was walking at her normal pace, which was to say she was walking quickly and without any theatrics about the injury. But he had learned 3 days ago that she was a woman who would walk at exactly the same pace regardless of what was happening to her body. So he looked past the pace to the set of her jaw, and the set of her jaw told him the cheekbone hurt considerably. The commission meeting, he said, went as expected. She came to a stop at the dock edge. Culver had 3 men waiting outside the courthouse when it was done, not Culver himself. He had somewhere else to be. 3 men. It's fine. I can see that. He hesitated. You need to cross tonight. I need to stay on this side tonight. The camp is on the North Moor, too far to walk in the dark with contested territory between here and there. She said it without any particular emotion, just laying out the facts of her situation. I'll find a place. Charles looked out at the moorland. The mist was thickening again as the light went, turning the world into layers of gray. There was not much on this side of the crossing: a landing shed, the dock itself, and his own mooring cottage 50 yards back from the bank. Small, low ceiling built by his father against the prevailing wind. He lived in it alone, had lived in it alone for 6 years since the last time someone had wanted to share the space. I have a floor and a fire, he said, and whatever's in the pot, which is probably not remarkable. She looked at him. The assessment again, that thorough, honest cataloging. I am not someone who requires rescuing, she said. I know that. You're someone who needs a floor and a fire. Those are just practical things. Another long look. I will pay. You're already my best regular customer this week, call it included. Something crossed her face that might have been warmth, quickly suppressed, quickly filed away. All right, she said. The cottage was indeed small. They both knew it the moment she ducked through the door and stood in the center of the room with her head not quite touching the beams. Charles put more wood on the fire and went to stir the pot without comment, because making someone feel large in a small space was only done by people who wanted the other person to feel bad about their own size, and Charles had no such impulse whatsoever. She sat on the floor near the fire, which was not what he'd expected. He gestured at the single chair, but then he understood. The chair was too small. She was choosing the floor on her own terms rather than being wedged into a chair that fit like a crate. He put a folded blanket on the floor beside her without making anything of it, and she used it without comment. They ate in a comfortable quiet that surprised him. He had not had a comfortable quiet with another person in the cottage for a long time. It was usually his quiets, and they tended to press down. The commission ruled partially in Culver's favor, she said eventually, staring at the fire. They acknowledged the boundary dispute, but tabled a final decision for 60 days. In 60 days, Culver will have had enough time to move cattle over the north parcel and establish use claim. Charles knew enough about land law to follow that. The clan's been using those stones as a seasonal boundary for how long? 3 generations, but we have no paper. Orcs didn't file papers 3 generations ago because the land offices didn't serve orcs 3 generations ago. She turned her head to look at him. You understand how this works. I'm beginning to. He picked at the edge of his bowl. Who's your advocate at the commission? I'm my own advocate. He looked at her. I speak their language, she said, with a dry edge that was not quite bitterness, not quite humor. All 3 of the commission members were surprised that I spoke their language well. I find that continually useful, the surprise, I mean. They underestimate, and I have time to do things before they recalibrate. 60 days is a short time. Yes, but I only need 30. She looked back at the fire. If I can get the original boundary survey records from the old Merwick Land Office, they predate the disputed commission. The clan's claim is valid under the Consolidated Land Charter. Merwick is 2 crossings south, though, and the roads are being watched. Culver's men, some of his, some hired. There are 5 or 6 of them on the moor roads now. Charles finished his stew. He set the bowl down and looked at the fire for a while, thinking. A woman alone on roads with 5 or 6 hired men between her and what she needed. A 60-day window, contested territory. My barge goes south to Merwick, he said. Takes half the time of the road and the river roads aren't blocked. They'd have to sink me and that tends to get expensive legally. He paused. And before you say it, yes, I know I'd be getting involved in something that isn't my business. But the river is my business. And I don't like Culver. She was very still. Then, why don't you like Culver? Because 3 years ago he tried to claim access rights to the South Dock, which would have let him control who crossed the river and who didn't. The commission ruled against him because he had no paper for it either. He doesn't like it when other people have access to things he wants to control. He looked at her. He's going to win this if you fight it the way he wants you to fight it. And what way is that? Alone, on roads, tired. He stood, took his bowl to the washing basin. Merwick on the river is a day and a half south. I run supplies down twice a month anyway. You could come as cargo. She didn't laugh at the word. She said, when? Day after tomorrow. I need to let things settle. Culver's men are probably watching the dock. 2 days, she said. 2 days. She turned back to the fire. The split on her cheek was darkening into a proper bruise now, and without thinking, with no thought whatsoever, which was the most honest kind of impulse, Charles reached to the shelf above the wash basin and brought down a small clay jar of yarrow salve that he kept for the particular physical indignities of ferryman work. He set it on the floor beside her and said nothing. She looked at the jar. She looked at him. She picked up the jar and used the salve, and the quietness between them settled back into something warm. The river south to Merwick moved through a different kind of country. The moor fell away, and the banks rose into rough stone escarpments and stands of black-trunked alder, and the water ran faster and cleaner than the slow Thornmere crossing. Charles worked the barge with the focused ease of long practice, reading the currents the way another man might read sentences, and Urzoth sat near the stern and watched him work. She had been watching him since they cleared the dock. He was aware of it in the specific, warm way a person is aware of attention that is genuinely interested rather than merely evaluating. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Ferrying, since I was 9. I was crewing with my father by then, started handling the barge myself at 14. You never wanted anything else," he thought about it honestly. "Sometimes, when I was younger, I thought about going south, seeing the trade cities, that sort of thing." He worked the pole through a fast shallows. "But the river is its mine, not the water, not the land, but the work, the skill of it. I know this river better than I know anything." He glanced at her. "That's not a small thing, I've come to think." She nodded slowly, knowing a thing completely. "Yes. My mother said the same thing about tracking." She was looking at the bank, but her voice had gone somewhere private and careful. "She could read ground the way you read water. She said the ground had opinions if you paid enough attention." "Is she?" He stopped. 3 years ago, Culver's predecessor, actually. Different dispute, different stretch of boundary, a pause, not dramatic, just letting the fact of it settle into the air between them. "Which is why I am here instead of her." Charles said nothing, because the right thing to say in that moment was nothing. He kept the barge to the center channel and let the quiet be what it was, which was the only decent thing you could do with a grief that belonged to someone else. After a time, she said, "You have no one." It wasn't rude. It was observational, the same way she'd noticed he ran the crossing alone, direct and without cruelty. "Not anymore," he said. "My father died 6 years back. My mother was gone before I could remember her properly. I've got acquaintances along the river, people I ferry, people I trade with." He pulled the pole. "It's a solitary work. You don't seem unhappy in it." "I'm not unhappy in it. That's different from not being lonely." He hadn't meant to say that. It came out because she had said true things and his mouth had apparently decided to reciprocate. He felt briefly exposed, the way you felt when you stepped outside on a cold morning. But Urzoth didn't make anything of it. She just looked at him with those gold eyes and said, quietly, "Yes, it is different." And somehow that was better than any reassurance he'd been offered in the 6 years since his father's barge had become just his barge. They made the overnight stop at a stone quay called Thornmere, a cluster of 4 crofts, and a shed that qualified as a trading post, inhabited by the kind of people who lived exactly in the middle of nowhere because they preferred it. Charles had used the key for years and had an arrangement with the crofter, a gray-haired woman named Me who asked no questions and provided hot tea and a dry barn loft and charged a reasonable rate. Me gave Urzoth a single look, then gave Charles a different look, the kind that old women who have known you since you were small reserve for moments they find interesting, and handed over 2 blankets and 2 cups of tea, and said the loft stairs were slippery. The loft was warm from the animals below, and smelled of hay and the particular dry sweetness of stored feed. Charles spread a blanket and sat against the sloped timber wall, and Urzoth sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth she put off, which was considerable. Orcs ran warm. He'd known that abstractly as a fact. He had not known it as a physical reality shared in close quarters, which was a very different kind of knowing. She had her knees up and her cup balanced on them and her head tilted back against the timber, and in the loft's low lantern light she looked not softer exactly but less armored, like a sword laid down on a table, still entirely a sword but resting. "Tell me about the Fireblood clan," he said. "If you want to," she considered. "We're not a raiding clan." "I want that said first because people here assume." "I don't assume. I know, I want it said anyway." She took a sip of tea. "We're a grazing clan. We've kept flocks on the North Moor boundary for 3 generations, summer grazing, winter movement south to the high heather. We trade wool and hides at Kettenvale Market when they let us." She said that last part flatly, no complaint in it, just the fact. "My grandmother negotiated the boundary arrangement with the Merwick Land Office before my mother was born. That's the record I need, the original survey and the use agreement. And you're doing this alone. No clan members with you." "The clan has 40 people. Half are women with young children, a third are old or injured. The rest," she paused, "they would come if I asked. But coming in numbers means Culver calls it a raid and the border militia gets involved. I come alone, I'm a woman with a land claim. Numbers change the story. That's a very precise calculation. It has to be." She looked at him from the side. "Why are you helping me? Genuinely, you don't know me, you owe me nothing." "I don't know," he said honestly. I think I've watched Culver take things for 3 years and I'm tired of watching. And I think you're right about the land, and the law is on your side if you can prove it, and it seems wrong to let the right thing lose because one person can't take on 5 armed men alone." He paused. "And you remind me of my father. The way you know your thing completely." She was very still. He felt suddenly that he'd said something larger than he'd intended. He looked at his tea. "Your father sounds like he was worth knowing," she said softly. "He was a beat." "Yes." She leaned her shoulder against his just slightly. Just the weight of contact, shoulder to shoulder, warm and deliberate and not retreating. He went perfectly still and didn't move because moving would have been the wrong thing. He just let it rest there, the warmth of her against him, and stared at the lantern, and felt the particular ache of not being alone. Merwick was a proper river town, stone quays and lime-washed buildings, and a market that ran 6 days of 7, with the land office at the north end of the high street looking official and unhelpful in the way of all official buildings. Charles tied the barge at the public quay and went up the gangway first, because Merwick was far enough from the Thornmere boundary that Culver's name meant less here. But an orc woman in warrior's leathers still drew a crowd of eyes that could turn hostile without much invitation. Urzoth walked beside him like she owned the street. He had already stopped being surprised by this. The land office was staffed by a thin man with ink on his fingers and the expression of someone permanently outnumbered by paperwork. He looked at Urzoth with the open, graceless surprise of someone who had never been taught to hide his reactions, and Charles stepped forward and said, pleasantly, "We're here to access archived survey records, pre-charter records from the Merwick boundary surveys. We have a commission case number." He had Urzoth's commission paperwork in his coat because she had handed it to him on the river and said, "You speak land office," and it hadn't been wrong. He laid the case number on the desk. The thin man looked at it, looked at Urzoth, looked at Charles. "It's a valid commission case," Charles said. "Open access is required by the Consolidated Charter, Section 12, which I'm sure you know." The man knew it. It was clear he knew it because he had the cornered look of someone who had just remembered a rule they'd hoped to sidestep. He disappeared into the back rooms and came back 20 minutes later with a dusty ledger and 3 folded survey maps on thick paper. Urzoth opened the ledger on the desk with careful hands, and Charles watched her face as she went through the entries. He saw the moment she found it, a faint, involuntary stillness, and then a long, slow breath through the nose. "Here," she said quietly. She turned the ledger so Charles could see. "My grandmother's name, signed as the agreeing party to the boundary use arrangement. Dated 46 years ago." She ran her finger along the column, "with the Land Commission seal. The original survey attaches the Northmore parcel to the Fireblood seasonal use arrangement for." Her voice dropped. "For 5 generations. 5 generations." They were only 3 in. Charles looked at the entry, looked at her face. The emotion she was allowing herself was not triumph. It was something quieter and deeper, something that had a lot of a dead woman in it. He said nothing. He asked the thin man for certified copies, produced the fee without argument, and stood beside her while she held the originals in her green hands and allowed herself that one moment of private, powerful feeling before she folded everything carefully and put it in her satchel. On the way out of the land office, she said, very quietly, "Thank you, Charles." It was the first time she'd said his given name. He noticed it the way you notice a door opening onto bright water. They were halfway back down the high street when the trouble found them. Not Culver's men, hired muscle, didn't travel this far for small business, but 3 young men from the river market, emboldened by each other and by drink at the midday hour, who had decided that an orc woman on their street was a situation requiring their input. They blocked the narrow street between 2 market stalls, and the one in front was talking before Charles and Urzoth had time to read the situation and adjust. Loud talk. The kind that was designed to draw an audience, to make spectacle of its target, to leave no dignity intact. Urzoth stopped walking. She did not move toward the men. She did not retreat. She simply stopped, and the stillness she went into was the specific stillness of a woman deciding exactly how much of her energy this deserved. Charles stepped forward, not in front of her, beside her. The distinction mattered. "Move," he said to the 3 young men, flat, no theater, just the word. "Your orc got you scared to talk," the front one said. "She doesn't scare me," Charles said. "You don't scare me either. Move. Maybe we'll take that satchel off her and see what she's got in." He didn't finish the sentence because Urzoth had stepped forward and picked the front young man up by the front of his shirt with one hand, efficiently and without apparent effort, and had lifted him to a height that made a very clear point about the structural difference in their situations. She held him there for 5 seconds. He went extremely quiet. His friends went equally quiet. The market stall nearest them suddenly found other things to look at. "No," Urzoth said to the young man conversationally. "You won't." She set him down. He stumbled back. The 3 of them departed at a pace that preserved none of their dignity and most of their lives. Charles looked at her. She looked at him. Something sparked in her gold eyes, bright and a little wicked, and he felt a grin break across his face before he could do anything about it. "You enjoy that," he said. "A little," she admitted. "Mostly I find it tiring." She turned back toward the key. "But sometimes, yes." He walked beside her, grinning, and she walked beside him, and the people on the high street moved out of their way, and it felt, in some way he didn't yet have language for, like something that had already been and always would be. The trouble at the Thornmere crossing when they returned was the kind that was harder to pick up and set down. It arrived in the form of a notice nailed to the dock post, printed on official commission paper, Culver's name at the bottom, citing a new petition that the ferry landing be classified as a commercial boundary access point and therefore subject to cooperative governance oversight, which in plain language meant Culver wanted to control the dock. Charles read it twice. Then he took it off the post and folded it into his coat pocket without a word. "He's moving faster than I expected," Urzoth said. She was reading it over his shoulder. He hadn't needed to hold it up for her, the height made it easy, but he tilted it slightly in her direction automatically, which was the kind of thing you did when you stopped thinking of someone as a separate situation and started thinking of them as a person you were with. "He's panicked," Charles said. "The commission meeting is in 12 days. He found out we went to Merwick somehow, or he guessed. If he can establish dock oversight before then, he has grounds to block your next crossing. He needs commission approval for the oversight petition. He needs one commissioner's signature to request a hearing. He's got at least one." Charles looked at the moor road. The fog was back. "It was always back. I need to file a counter-petition in the next 4 days or the hearing happens without my response. I'll go with you. To the courthouse in Kettenvale." He thought about that. "That's not going to be a pleasant trip." "No, but you've been into my unpleasant things. I'll come into yours." He looked at her. There was something extraordinarily solid about the way she said it, not a concession or an obligation, just a fact stated as clearly as a ferryman naming the current. "All right," he said. They went inside the cottage and spread the commission documents on the floor by the fire, and Urzoth pulled the Merwick survey records from her satchel and laid them out beside Charles's deed for the landing, and they sat across from each other, cross-legged on the floor with a lantern between them, and worked through the legal language the way you worked through a bad crossing methodically, checking every depth, finding the path that led somewhere safe. He was aware of her hands on the paper. Long-fingered, strong, moving through the documents with precision. He was aware of the way she leaned in when something caught her attention, the way the lantern light moved across her face. He was aware of these things in the specific way you became aware of something that had been there for a while and that you had been declining to name. He named it now, privately and without ceremony. He was falling for her. He was pretty thoroughly falling for her and had been since she'd stepped onto his barge in the morning fog and looked at the far bank like she was going to conquer it. He kept his eyes on the documents and said nothing, and they worked until well after midnight. The Kettenvale courthouse sat at the center of the town behind a stone wall that was more decorative than defensive, but still conveyed the intended message. Authority lives here, and you are here to approach it on its own terms. Charles had been inside 3 times in his life. The interior smelled of old paper and tallow, and the particular cold of stone that never properly warmed. He and Urzoth filed the counter-petition at the morning clerk's window, and the clerk, a woman of middle years and absolute efficiency, took the documents, date-stamped them without comment, and directed them to the commission waiting room. There were 6 other people in the waiting room, all of them human. All of them aware that Urzoth had walked in, and all of them recalibrating their idea of the morning accordingly. Charles took a seat. Urzoth took the seat beside him, and the person on the far side of that seat, a man in a wool merchant's coat, decided he needed to be slightly farther right than he'd previously been. Urzoth watched him shift without any expression whatsoever, and Charles felt a low, quiet anger that he kept in his chest because this was not the place for it. He leaned slightly so that his shoulder was against hers, the way she'd done in the barn loft, and stared at the wall ahead of him. He felt her notice it. He felt her make the small choice to let it stand. The preliminary hearing was brief and procedural. Both petitions acknowledged. A formal hearing scheduled for 6 days hence, both parties to attend with full evidence and legal argument. Charles stated the counterpetition grounds clearly, citing the existing land deed for the dock and the charter provision against cooperative governance applying to private landing rights. The commissioner, a gray-haired man who kept looking at Urzoth with the same quality of uncomfortable surprise that the Merwick clerk had shown, made his notes and declared the hearing scheduled. Outside in the courthouse yard, Culver was waiting. He was not alone. He had 4 men with him, one of whom was the broad man from the dock, still with his hand near his axe, and he had positioned them between the courthouse gate and the street in a way that was not technically blocking the path, but was absolutely intended to make a point. Charles walked out of the courthouse ahead of Urzoth and stopped 6 feet from Culver. He made himself stay loose, shoulders down, breathing even, because he was not a fighting man, he was a ferryman, and the gap between those things was real. But he also understood that backing down wasn't always the right answer. "You're making this harder on yourself, Prescott," Culver said. "I've got a legal counterpetition filed." "I don't see how that makes anything harder. The boundary hearing goes through in 6 days. You've got nothing to offer that changes that." Culver's eyes went to Urzoth, who was now standing beside Charles. "And you're mixing yourself up in something that's going to cost you. Dock access, ferrying rights, that can all become complicated." "Then we'll go through the complicated thing and come out the other side," Charles said. "That's how the process works. The process works for people the Commission wants to work with." "Yes, which is why we filed paper." Culver looked at him with a flat, assessing displeasure. Then his eyes went back to Urzoth. "You should take your records and your claim and go back to the moor," he said to her quietly, with the specific quality of threat that tries to sound like advice. "The north parcel isn't worth what you're going to go through for it." Urzoth looked at him for a long, steady moment. "It was my mother's," she said. "So yes, it is." Culver held her gaze. She didn't move. He looked away first, which was the only possible outcome of looking into those gold eyes on that particular morning, and he and his 4 men moved aside and let them pass. On the street, walking away, Charles said very quietly, "You're remarkable." She was quiet for a pace or two. Then, "So are you, for what it's worth." He felt that settle into him, warm and clean as river water in summer. Over the following 5 days, they became something that had not quite existed before. Not allies, though they were that. Not companions in the conventional sense, though they were that too. Something that happened in the specific way of 2 people who have been separately lonely for a long time and find themselves, without quite planning it, no longer alone. She slept on the cottage floor every night, fireside, because the moor roads were watched, and it wasn't safe to make the 2-hour walk to the clan camp in darkness. Charles moved his own blankets to the floor too, without making a ceremony of it. The bed was a solitary thing, and the floor was where they'd been talking until late, and sleeping near a fire with the river sound outside was not a hardship. She didn't comment. He didn't explain. They simply did it. He learned her in pieces and kept each piece carefully. She had grown up with the clan, learned the borderland the way he'd learned the river, completely, by doing, by falling and recovering and trying again. She was 28, 3 years his junior. She played no instruments, but she could whistle in 2 separate octaves, which she demonstrated once without preamble when she was thinking through a problem and didn't realize she was doing it. She had a dry, precise humor that emerged without announcement and was twice as funny for it. She cared about her clan with a ferocity that was quiet precisely because it was absolute. She didn't announce it. It showed in everything she did. She also watched him. He felt it throughout each day, not with discomfort but with the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being seen by someone who was genuinely looking. She watched him read the river, navigate the barge, handle difficult passengers with the calm, consistent honesty he'd been applying to all of it his whole working life. She watched him and she didn't look away, and he found he didn't want her to. On the 4th evening, he made something better than stew, a proper meal, river fish and root vegetables and a bread he'd traded for at the Thornmere quay. He set it out on the floor between them because the table was narrow and the floor was where they already were, and she looked at the spread and then at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded for a full 3 seconds before she contained it. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know." He sat down across from her. "I wanted to." Those 3 seconds of unguarded expression came back briefly. They ate slowly and they talked about the hearing, about the survey records, about the clan, about his father, about a dozen other things. And at some point, the talking stopped being about useful things and started being about the kind of things you said to someone you wanted to know better. Her grandmother's voice. The first time she'd stood alone on the North Moor and known the land was hers in the way of deep belonging. The things she missed, the weight of being the one who handled all the hard things for the people she loved. "Do you ever get to put it down?" he asked. The handling of things, she thought about it. "Not often," she said. "It needs to be done and I'm the one who can do it." "That's not the same as not needing a rest." "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." He was close enough to reach out. He'd been close enough for days. He hadn't, because the difference between being wanted and assuming you're wanted was a line he had no intention of crossing without invitation. She reached out. Her hand on his large, warm, the fingers curling around his with a certainty that left no ambiguity. He turned his hand over and held on. "Charles," she said. He looked up. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the far bank from the prow on the morning they'd met, like something she had decided to go toward. Direct, certain, completely her own choice. He leaned across the small distance between them and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same complete, deliberate commitment she brought to every single thing she did, and the world outside the cottage. The moor and the river and Culver and the commission and the 6-day clock went very quiet for a while. When they came apart, she pressed her forehead to his very gently. Her hands were on his face. His were on her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the leather and the close, real weight of her presence against him. "I don't do things halfway," she said. Low, close. A warning and a promise at the same time. "I know," he said. "Neither do I." She made a sound, not the controlled, almost swallowed laugh of the early days. A real laugh, warm and open and belonging entirely to him, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him that he would work the rest of his life for more of that sound. The hearing day arrived on a cold morning with no fog, the moor sharp and bare under a pale sky, the standing stones visible from the dock for the first time in a week, dark against the frost-white heather. Charles and Urzoth walked the moor road to Kettenvale together, the survey documents in her satchel, the counterpetition copies in his coat. They didn't hold hands on the road because you couldn't know who was watching, and giving Culver a reason to make this about something other than land law was tactically stupid. But they walked close, and once when the road dipped down through a hollow and the standing stones blocked the sight line to the town, she put her hand briefly in his and squeezed once hard and let go. The Kettenvale courthouse hearing room was a stone room that served as court, commission chamber, and public meeting space, with long benches along the walls and a raised table at the north end for the 3 commissioners. It was full. That was the first surprise. Charles had expected a routine administrative hearing, small and procedural. But the room was full, nearly 40 people, because a boundary dispute between an established land cooperative and an orc clan that had filed paper was, in Kettenvale terms, a significant event. Culver was already at the petitioner's table with a man in a dark coat who was clearly his legal advocate. The advocate had the pampered, confident air of someone who charged by the word and charged well. Charles and Urzoth took the respondent's table. No advocate, they hadn't been able to afford one, and Urzoth had said flatly, "I can present this better than any advocate he could name. No one knows this case better than me." Which was true, and Charles had not argued it. The lead commissioner, a heavy-set woman named Calloway who had a reputation for patience and impartiality, called the room to order. Culver's advocate went first, and he was smooth and well-prepared, citing grazing utilization surveys and infrastructure investment, and the cooperative's contribution to Kettenvale's economy, building a picture of a well-established organization with deep roots and legitimate interests in the North Parcel. He said traditional use several times in a particular tone that implied other kinds of use didn't count. Then Urzoth stood up. The room went very still. Not all of it hostile, some of it simply the specific quality of attention people gave to someone who carried themselves the way she did, the unignorable quality of a person who was completely present in their own body and completely confident in their purpose. She began with the survey record. She laid it on the table and named every element of it: date, parties, commission seal, the precise boundary description that included the north parcel within the Fireblood seasonal use arrangement. She spoke clearly and at a pace that left no gaps for interruption, and she sourced every statement to a specific document or legal provision, and the room that had come in expecting theater got something it hadn't expected: a precise, documented, legally sound land claim, presented by the woman whose grandmother had negotiated the original arrangement 46 years ago. When she was done, there was a silence that was not hostile. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. Commissioner Calloway asked a question. Urzoth answered it with specifics. The second commissioner asked another. Urzoth answered that too, and cited the exact charter section. And when Culver's advocate tried to interject, Calloway told him to wait his turn with a look that suggested she had already formed a preliminary opinion. Culver's advocate cross-presented, trying to argue that a 46-year-old use arrangement wasn't binding under the current consolidated charter. Urzoth responded immediately, standing without being called on, and Calloway let her because the room had clearly decided she was more interesting than procedure, and cited Section 31 of the Consolidated Charter, which specifically grandfathered pre-charter use arrangements that had been filed with an authorized land office. She had the section memorized. She quoted it verbatim. The advocate tried again. She answered again. This happened 3 times, and each time the answer was shorter and more specific, and the advocate's position was slightly more cornered than it had been, until Culver leaned over and said something in his advocate's ear, and the advocate sat down and stopped. Commissioner Calloway conferred with the other 2 commissioners in a low voice for 4 minutes. Charles counted. He was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface, and his eyes on the commissioners and his heart hammering, because this was it. This was the moment, and the woman beside him had done everything any human being could do, and the outcome was now in the hands of 3 people he didn't control. Calloway turned back to the room. The Commission finds the Merwick Boundary Survey records to be valid and binding under the Consolidated Land Charter, Section 31. The Northmoor parcel is confirmed as Fireblood seasonal use land for the duration of the original arrangement, with appropriate renewal processes to follow upon the arrangement's natural expiration. She looked at Culver's table. The cooperative's petition for access is denied. The Prescott dock counterpetition is upheld, and the cooperative's dock oversight petition is dismissed. The room was very quiet for 2 seconds. Then it wasn't. Not a cheer. This wasn't a sporting event, but a buzz, a collective exhalation, the sound of a room full of people renegotiating what they thought they knew about the situation. Charles heard it from a long way away, because most of his awareness was on the woman sitting beside him, whose hands had gone perfectly still on the table in front of her, and whose face was doing something very controlled and very profound that he recognized as the specific expression of a person who has been carrying something enormous for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. He put his hand over hers on the table, right there in the full view of the hearing room. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He covered her hand with his and held it, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and that was that. Culver left without speaking. His advocate gathered the papers with the efficient speed of someone who billed for the gathering and had no further business here. The room emptied slowly, and several people stopped by the respondents' table, some from curiosity, some because they'd had their own disputes with Culver's cooperative and found this outcome satisfying, and a few because they had watched an orc woman conduct a legal case from memory and wanted to say something about it, even if they weren't quite sure what. Commissioner Calloway stopped by last. She looked at Urzoth and said, "Well argued," in the tone of a woman who did not give that particular compliment cheaply. "Thank you, Commissioner," Urzoth said. When the room was finally empty and it was just the 2 of them at the respondents' table with the documents spread out between them, Urzoth put both her hands flat on the table and looked down at them for a long moment, and then she looked up at Charles, and there were no controlled expressions anywhere on her face. Just the truth of her, what it had cost, what it meant, what she felt. "We did it," she said, Her voice was not quite steady. "You did it," he said. "I just held the lamp." She shook her head very slightly. "You held considerably more than the lamp." He held her gaze. "Your mother would have been proud." That hit her. He saw it land. She breathed through it steadily, and something crossed her face that was grief and pride combined into a feeling that had no simple name, and he thought he would never forget her face in that moment, the strength of her and the full human rawness of it. She stood. He stood. And then he was holding her properly, both arms around her and her face against the top of his head. She was taller, and he had always been aware of the height and had never thought of it as anything other than what it was. A fact about her body, the same way her gold eyes were a fact about her body. And she held him back with a completeness that told him everything about what this meant to her. Outside the courthouse, in the cold yard under the pale sky, the standing stones were visible to the north. Dark, ancient, patient, marking the boundary of a land that was still and now properly again hers. They walked back along the moor road in the mid-afternoon light, and somewhere in the first mile Urzoth took his hand and kept it, and the moor road was wide enough that it didn't need to be a secret. He thought about what he'd said to her, that he hadn't expected to find himself here, in the middle of something this large, and about how entirely true it still was and how entirely fine. "What happens now?" he asked. "For the clan." "Bring the herd up to the north parcel in 3 weeks. The seasonal timing is right. The clan will settle in for the summer grazing." She looked across the moor. "I'll need to file the formal boundary confirmation at the Kettenvale Land Office in the next 10 days. Then it's done, properly done." A pause. "My grandmother's arrangement renewed for my generation." "That's good," he said simply. "It is." She was quiet for a stride or two. "I have been afraid, I think is the word, that we would lose it. That the clan would lose the land and I would have failed my mother's work. I've been afraid of that for 3 years." She said it levelly as a piece of information, but he knew what it cost her to say it at all. "I'm not afraid of it now." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back once, hard. They were close to the dock landing when the man stepped out from behind the largest of the standing stones at the boundary turn in the road. The broad man from Culver's group, the one with the axe. He was alone, which meant either that Culver hadn't sent him and he was here on his own choosing, or that the others were somewhere he couldn't see, which was worse. "Heard the commission ruling," the broad man said. He wasn't drawing the axe. He was just standing there blocking the road with a quality of bottled-up grievance that had been looking for somewhere to go. "Culver's been good to a lot of people in this county. You've made things hard for him." "The law made things hard for him," Charles said. "We just used the law." "She used the law." The broad man's eyes were on Urzoth. "And you helped her. A human man helping an orc against his own kind." "She's a citizen with a valid land claim," Charles said. "And she's not against anyone. She's for her clan's land. And you're for her." The way he said it made it a different kind of accusation. "Yes," Charles said, plainly, "I am." The broad man looked at him for a long moment, and Charles met his eyes and didn't move. And the particular thing that happened in those moments between men when one of them is deciding whether to go further happened, and after about 10 seconds the broad man looked away. Not at Urzoth this time. At the moor. Something in him had run its calculation and found the answer wasn't worth the trouble. He stepped aside. Charles walked forward with Urzoth beside him, and they passed through the gap and went down the track toward the dock. And he didn't look back, and neither did she. At the dock she stopped and faced him, and he stopped facing her, and the river was behind him, and the moor was all around them, and the pale sky was turning toward evening. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Yes." She reached up and unclasped the war-cloak from her shoulder. It came free with a sound of heavy cloth and settled over her arm, deep red, sweeping, real and heavy and entirely itself. She had worn it since the first morning on the barge, folded over her arm then as now, and it was the mark of who she was and where she came from as clearly as the tusks and the clan name. She stepped forward and draped it over his shoulders. He felt the weight of it settle, considerable, warm, the oiled fabric heavy across his collarbones and falling down his back. It smelled like smoke and open air and something that was simply and entirely her. He stood very still and looked at her face. She looked back at him with those gold eyes, steady and direct and completely certain. "In Fireblood custom," she said, "you drape your war-cloak over the person you are choosing, the one you intend to stand with." Her voice was level, but there was a current running under it, something warm and deep and entirely earnest. "It is a declaration, in front of whoever is watching." She paused. "I am aware we are on a dock with no audience, but the principle is the same." He looked at her. He felt the weight of the cloak on his shoulders and the weight of what she was saying, and both were entirely fine and right and good. "And," she said, and something came into her voice that was part challenge and part the specific tone of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, "I dare you to remove it." The silence between them had the quality of held breath. Not uncomfortable, full. He didn't remove it. He reached up instead and pulled the collar of it higher on his shoulders, settling it more fully, and he saw her eyes go warm in the way that a lantern went warm when the flame caught fully, not brighter, exactly, just more completely itself. "Then we're settled," she said softly. "We are," he said. "Very." He stepped forward and kissed her in the open, on the dock, with the river behind them and the moor wind moving over the standing stones, and she kissed him back with the full and unguarded completeness of a woman who had decided and did not do things halfway. When they came apart, she looked at the cloak on his shoulders with an expression he would carry for the rest of his life, proprietary and tender and entirely hers. "It suits you," she said. "It's far too large for me." "Yes," she agreed, with the smile that was becoming the realest thing in his world. And yet, the following weeks moved differently than the weeks before. Not slower, there was still work, still the river, still the process of filing confirmation documents, and ensuring the Kettenvale Land Office properly recorded the commission outcome and had its paperwork correct to the last detail, because Culver was a man who would use any administrative gap he could find, and the gaps needed to not exist. But the quality of the movement was different. The clan moved the herd to the North Parcel. Charles ferried the first group of clan members across the Thornmere crossing on a clear morning. 6 adults and a great deal of bundled equipment, and 3 large, disgruntled goats, and not one of them was charged anything other than the standard fare rate. He ran 2 more crossings for them that day and a third the next, and by the end of it, he knew the names of every adult in the Fireblood clan and had been assessed, clearly and thoroughly, by every single one of them. The assessment, he understood, was Urzoth's business. He was hers. She had said so publicly in the Fireblood way, and the clan needed to know who that was. He bore it without discomfort because the scrutiny was honest and the people applying it were people he was coming to like. An older woman named Draped, who had known Urzoth's mother, stopped before she stepped off the barge and looked at Charles for a long, measuring moment. Then she said something in the clan's own tongue, low and deliberate, looking at him as she said it. Urzoth, standing at the dock, heard it. He saw the color change in her green skin, a warmer cast, a flush, however orcs showed that particular response. "What did she say?" he asked when Draped had moved on. Urzoth was quiet for a moment. "She said that my mother would approve, and that I have," she paused, "chosen with the same quality of eye." He felt that like warmth from a fire. He looked back to the river and steered the empty barge back for the next crossing, and allowed himself to feel it in full, without any qualification. There was a problem with the Kettenvale Land Office on the 7th day. The clerk who processed the formal confirmation filing, not the same efficient woman who had date-stamped their initial documents, but a different one, younger, with anxious eyes, told them the confirmation required a co-signature from an authorized land agent for boundary cases involving non-human claimants. This was a rule that Charles had never heard of. He said so politely and specifically, citing the 2 separate sections of the Consolidated Charter he'd spent the past 2 weeks reading. The clerk looked at her manual. She found the rule. She showed him the rule. The rule was there. It was also in a subsection that explicitly exempted cases where the original arrangement predated the non-human registration requirements, which the Fireblood arrangement did. He pointed to that exemption. The clerk read it 3 times with the focused anxiety of someone who needed to get this right and was not entirely sure how to read legal language. "I need to refer this to the senior commissioner's office," she said finally. "How long will that take?" "A week." He thought about the clock. There wasn't a critical deadline now. The commission ruling was complete. The clock that Culver had imposed was done, but a week of delay was a week of incompleteness, and he had learned that Urzoth could not properly rest with a thread still open. He looked at her. She was looking at the clerk with the contained patience of someone who had sat through worse delays than this. He asked to speak to the senior clerk directly. The clerk fetched the senior clerk, a bald man with a methodical disposition who read the relevant sections side by side, consulted a reference volume, and said that yes, the exemption applied and the confirmation could be processed today. It took 40 minutes. Then it was done. Filed, stamped, recorded. The Northmore parcel, Fireblood seasonal use, confirmed for the duration of the original arrangement with appropriate renewal provisions. Urzoth held the stamped confirmation copy and looked at it for a long, silent moment. Then she folded it carefully into her satchel, in the same place she'd carried the Merwick survey records. "Done," Charles said. "Done," she said. He bought them both something hot to eat from a market stall on the way back to the river, and they sat on a low stone wall in the Kettenvale Market Square and ate in the midday sun, shoulder to shoulder with the noise of the market around them and no particular urgency anywhere, and it was the most peaceable Charles had felt in 6 years. Maybe longer. "What happens with Culver?" she asked. "He'll try something else eventually. He's that kind of man." Charles considered. "But right now he has no legal grounds for anything. If he tries physical interference with the herd or the boundary, it's a criminal matter, not a civil one, and that's a different kind of trouble than land claims. He's not stupid enough to escalate to criminal. He hired men to wait outside the courthouse. That was intimidation, not assault. It's a line he won't cross." He thought about it. "He'll sit with it for a season, let his pride calm down, maybe come back around to trying a different petition in a year or 2, but he knows the legal ground now and you've built the record." He looked at her. "He's not winning this." She nodded slowly. "My mother fought him for 2 years before." She stopped. Started again. "Before, she never got to the record stage. She didn't have the paper from Merwick." "You got the paper." "We got the paper," she said, and it was deliberate, the pronoun, and it meant everything. He took her hand again, on the stone wall in the middle of the Kettenvale Market Square, in the full view of everyone walking past, and nobody stopped to make a problem of it, and the sun was on them, and the world was movable and decent and real. He went to the clan camp on the Northmore 3 nights later. Not because it was necessary for anything practical, but because Urzoth had asked him, and it was the first time she had asked him for something that wasn't practical. It was a different kind of asking, quieter, with a quality of want to it that was distinct from need. The camp was a circle of hide tents around a central fire, the herd visible on the far side of the slope in the last light, the standing stones rising from the heather at the camp's north boundary. It was a real place lived in, organized, home-shaped. Children's voices on the wind. The children were there, but they stayed at a distance, watching him with wide eyes and occasional whispered commentary among themselves. The smell of a proper cook fire and something roasting on it. Dratha cooked. She was the clan elder, and apparently this was what she did for significant occasions. Charles ate what he was given and said it was very good, which was true, and Dratha looked at him across the fire with the approval of a woman whose approval did not come free. After the meal, the fire settled lower, and people drifted to their tents, and Charles and Urzoth were alone at the fireside with the moor all around them and the standing stones dark against the star-bright sky. She had the war-cloak on her shoulders again. She'd taken it back when he was aboard the barge, because it was a practical garment, and she wore it for warmth and weight on cold evenings, and he hadn't minded the returning of it because the giving of it was what mattered, not the keeping. But now she looked at him across the fire and reached up and unclasped it again. And this time she stood and brought it around him properly, settling it over his shoulders herself, her hands smoothing it across his collarbone and adjusting the weight of it at the back with a deliberateness that was entirely not about warmth. "In the clan," she said, standing close enough that the fire made her amber and the stars were behind her, "when you've draped the cloak and the person hasn't removed it, when they've chosen to stay under it, the next step is the mark." He looked at her. "What is the mark?" "A bite," she said. "Over the shoulder, the claim mark. It tells every other person, human, orc, anyone, that this one is chosen, that I have chosen." He was very still, not afraid. Fear wasn't what he was feeling. What he was feeling was the specific, deep, still gravity of a moment you recognize as the kind you will carry forever. "Does it?" He paused. "Does it hurt?" Her mouth curved. "A little." "And what does it mean formally?" "It means that I have named you mine and I intend to keep you." She held his gaze. "It is permanent. I don't give the mark lightly and I don't give it twice." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire snapped. The stars moved their slow degrees. The herd was a quiet, grazing presence on the slope. "Then give it," he said. She leaned in, and he felt the warmth of her breath against the curve of his shoulder and neck, and then the press of her and the brief, bright pain of her tusks, and then the warmth of her mouth over it, gentle and absolute and thoroughly hers. He gripped her arm and breathed through it and felt it settle into him not as pain but as something elemental, the way the river settled into a ferryman until you could not separate the man from the water. She drew back and looked at him. Her eyes were everything warm and certain and entirely open. "Mine," she said quietly between them where it was only for them. "Yours," he said. "And you." "And I," she agreed. "I'm yours. That is how this works." He kissed her then with everything in him, both hands in her hair, the war-cloak wide around his shoulders, the fire and the moor and the ancient standing stones witness to the whole of it. They stayed at the fire a long while after, her head against his shoulder and his arm around her, the warmth of the cloak over them both, talking in the way of two people who have stopped performing and started simply being. He told her about the first time he'd run the Thornmere crossing alone, at 14, in a summer storm his father had thought he wasn't ready for. She told him about the first time she'd stood at the north boundary stones alone, at 19, and understood that the land was her responsibility now. Two people who had each been carrying large things, separately and for a long time, learning what it felt like to put the weight down between them and share it. He fell asleep against her, sometime in the deep part of the night, and she let him. And when he woke, the fire had burned down to coals, and the sky was just beginning to separate the black from the very dark blue. The dawn that came over the moorland was pale and clean and specific in the way of autumn mornings, no fog, for once. The moor lay open in every direction, heather and sedge and stone, the standing stones at the north boundary catching the first light and going warm with it. The Thornmere was a gray thread to the south. The herd moved slowly on the slope with the contented quietness of animals on good grazing. Urzoth was awake beside him, sitting up with her knees drawn in, watching the light come. The war-cloak was around her shoulders again, and the mark on his shoulder was a warm, settled ache that he was aware of in the way of a thing that had permanently become part of you. He watched her profile against the dawn and thought, with the simple and total clarity that came from having slept well and woken to something good, that this was the realest he had felt in his adult life. "The clan is settled," he said. It wasn't a question. "The clan is settled," she said. "For the season and then a proper winter arrangement with the South Heather. The herd will be stronger by spring. The wool will be," she paused, and the pause had something almost shy in it, "better than last year. Dratha says she's almost never wrong." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "And you," she turned her head and looked at him. "What do you want?" he said. "Not for the clan, for you." She was quiet for a while, not avoiding the question, processing it the way she processed everything, honestly and without shortcut. "I want to not have to fight for everything," she said finally. I'm not afraid of the fight, you know that, but I want," she looked back at the dawn. "I want one thing that is just mine and good without a battle on either side of it." A pause. "I think I have that." He reached out and found her hand, and she turned it over and held on with both of hers, facing the sunrise together over the North Moor. "Stay," she said, not as a demand, not even quite as a question. As a hope held out openly by a woman who didn't hold things out openly without meaning every syllable of it. "I'm a ferryman," he said. "I'll always be on the river. The river runs past the North Moor. It does. And the dock is a short walk, half an hour on a good morning." "Then stay," she said again. He looked at the moor and the light in her hands around his. He thought about the cottage and the solitary crossings and the 6 years of adequate but empty evenings. He thought about the sound of her laugh when it was real, and the weight of her war-cloak and the mark on his shoulder, and what it felt like to not be lonely in the particular, hollowing way he had been lonely for a very long time. "Yes," he said, "I'll stay." She turned to him, and in the full pale light of the morning she was herself without armor or performance, tall and strong and quietly joyful in a way that was rare and enormously real. And she pressed her forehead to his temple, and he felt her breathe out, long and slow, the way you breathed when you had been holding something tightly for years and had finally found somewhere safe to set it. Culver filed no further petitions. The word moved through the county the way such words did through ferry gossip and market conversation, and the particular telegraph of people who noticed when power shifted. And what moved was simply the fact of the confirmed boundary and the woman who had argued it and won. It was not a celebration. It was simply a record, and records had their own gravity. Charles still ran the Thornmere crossing. He ran it through the autumn and the winter, and the Fireblood clan used it regularly for market trips to Kettenvale, and he charged them the standard rate and they paid it. And over time the crossing became a normal piece of the landscape for the county in the specific way of things that had been contested until they stopped being contested. He expanded the mooring cottage in early winter, not dramatically, just a second room built onto the east side with proper height in the ceiling, and a window that faced the moor rather than the river. Urzoth helped with the building, which meant the east wall went up considerably faster than Charles had planned, because she could hoist the stone without the block-end tackle he'd been intending to use, and she found this mildly amusing and did not say so out loud, but the quality of amusement was entirely audible. She spent 3 nights of 7 at the cottage and 4 at the camp, because the clan needed her, and the clan was her people, and this was not a compromise. It was just the shape of a life that had 2 centers of gravity and moved between them with intention. Charles understood this completely, because the river was the same, not a place he went to but a thing he was, and a partner who understood that was worth more than one who tried to change it. On the night she was at the camp, the cottage was quiet but differently quiet, not the pressing, hollow quiet of aloneness, more the quality of quiet that belongs to a room that has had warmth in it and will have warmth in it again. He found this to be an enormous and simple difference. In the deep of winter, when the Thornmere froze at the edges and the crossings went a 3 per day, and the moor was white and the standing stones wore caps of snow, she brought something from the clan camp and set it on the shelf above the wash basin in the cottage. A small carved figure in dark stone, old, worn smooth, the figure of a person standing with arms slightly out, which Urzoth said was the Fireblood clan sign for guardian. Her grandmother had carved it. "She would want you to have it," Urzoth said. "Or something of mine to have it, which amounts to the same thing." He looked at the figure and then at her. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that was adequate, and adequacy was not the point. He put his arms around her and she put her head against his. She had to come down for this, a slight deliberate tilt, and they stood together in the kitchen of the cottage with the fire going and the winter outside, and he thought clearly and without any reservation that this was the best his life had ever been or was likely to be. It felt like enough, more than enough. It felt, specifically, like the thing that had been missing from all the years that had come before it. Spring came in with meltwater and river noise, the Thornmere running high and strong and gray with snowmelt from the upland, and Charles ran the crossings at full attention with the water at its most demanding. Urzoth came to the dock on the first warm morning and stood at the prow the way she had on the first morning, arms crossed, watching the far bank emerge from what remained of the last fog, and he worked the barge from the stern and watched her and thought about how entirely right she looked there. She turned around and caught him watching. The gold eyes held his, steady and warm, and with that particular warmth that was for him and no one else in the world. "You're watching again," she said. "I'm allowed," he said. "You're mine." She laughed, real, open, entirely his, and the river ran on and the moor lay wide and the standing stones stood patient in the spring light, and the north parcel was green and the herd was on it, and everything that had been wrong had been made right by the specific means of two people who had refused to stop until it was. He guided the barge to the landing and stepped off first and offered her his hand, and this time, without any ceremony or visible decision, she took it. She didn't need help off the barge. She never had. She took his hand because she wanted to, and wanting to was the only reason that had ever mattered, and they stood on the dock in the spring morning with the river behind them and the moor ahead of them and the war-cloak on her shoulders and the mark on his, and the whole of everything they had built between them solid and real in the ordinary, extraordinary daylight. No fog today, clear to every horizon. They could see all the way to the north boundary stones from the dock. Standing in their old, deliberate line, dark against the pale spring sky. Hers, theirs. He held her hand and she held his, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in all the ways that counted, in a hearing room in Kettenvale, on a dock in the autumn, at a fireside under the stars, in the warmth of a too-small cottage made just large enough. The morning held them, and they held it, and that was how it ended, not with ceremony or spectacle, but with two people who had chosen each other standing in the open, on a river bank, in the clear light of a day that belonged entirely to them.